Welcome to our story.
Christmas Eve had always been loud on the plantation, loud in a way that tried to pretend joy existed. Lanterns hung from nails like borrowed stars. The masters drank more than usual, their laughter slurring into the night air, boots tracking mud and wine across the porch. The enslaved were ordered to smile wider, work faster, bow deeper, as if the holiday required extra obedience. For her, the noise felt distant, like hearing a storm from underwater. She remembered cold first, not the sharp kind that stung skin, but the slow, creeping cold that settled into the bones when the sun disappeared and work was finally done. She stood behind the kitchen quarters with her mother and her two younger brothers, sharing warmth through proximity rather than blankets. Her mother's arm wrapped around all three of them, thin but unbreakable, the way it had always felt. That night, her mother had whispered that tomorrow might be easier, that holidays softened cruel men. The lie was gentle, meant to protect, but lies still broke when stepped on. They came after the bell rang for night rest. 4 white men, 2 overseers and 2 guests, drunk on rum and authority. No rush, no urgency. Orders were read aloud like scripture, official and clean. Her mother was sold south, effective immediately. One brother was claimed as payment for debt. The other was promised to a neighboring estate. There was paperwork, there were signatures. There was laughter about Christmas bargains. She learned then how quickly sound could disappear. Her own screaming seemed to vanish before it reached her ears. Her hands clawed at coats, sleeves, anything solid, until one of the overseers struck her hard enough to teach her gravity. She hit the ground and stayed there, watching boots move away with her family inside them. Her mother turned once, just once, eyes wide with apology, as if this were a personal failure rather than a theft. By morning, the plantation smelled like pine and cooked meat. She woke alone. Years passed, but Christmas never left her. It followed her like a scar that itched when the air turned cold. She was moved twice, then sold again, each transaction stripping away another layer of who she used to be. Her name was shortened, then changed, then forgotten altogether. What remained was memory, sharp and preserved. Faces, voices, hands that signed papers and shook on deals. The night they took her family became a ledger in her mind, every name recorded in ink that never faded. She learned to survive quietly, to listen more than speak, to watch men when they believed themselves unseen. Masters loved to talk about themselves, especially when drunk, especially when confident no one present counted as human. She learned routes between properties, the way dogs were trained, the schedules of patrols. Knowledge collected itself around her like armor. The first man died in spring. He was not one of the overseers from that night, just a small piece of the machine. A trader who had boasted about holiday sales years earlier, laughing over a cracked mug as he remembered families separated for profit. She recognized his scarred knuckles immediately. The memory came with a smell of rum and pine. It wasn't rage that guided her, but precision. She waited until he was alone, until his arrogance replaced caution. His death was quiet, almost disappointing in its simplicity. When it was done, she felt nothing close to relief, only a sense of correctness, like aligning a crooked picture on the wall. She did not stop. Over time, her list grew shorter, then longer, then shorter again, as names were crossed out. Overseers, accountants, landowners who signed orders without looking up, men who considered themselves decent because they never held the whip personally. She learned that killing did not heal her, but it organized the chaos. Each death restored a fraction of balance, even if the world itself remained broken. She moved like a rumor. Plantations whispered about a sickness, about disappearances, about slaves running away and masters vanishing soon after. No one connected the dots because no one believed a woman like her could be the hand guiding them. That disbelief became her greatest shield. Every December, the memory sharpened. She marked time by winters, by the way the air changed and men grew sentimental. Christmas made them careless. They drank more, they reminisced, they revisited old stories, they named names.
One Christmas Eve, nearly a decade after her family was taken, she stood outside a grand house that glowed with candlelight. Inside, music spilled through open windows. The owner entertained guests, boasting about his holdings, his past successes, the night he secured 3 bodies for the price of 1. Her mother's sale had been his triumph. She waited until the house slept. What followed was not quick, but it was thorough. By morning, the plantation woke to silence where laughter had been. She left before the sun rose, moving through frost-covered fields with steady breath and steady hands. She never returned to that place, but she carried its end with her. Another name crossed off, another weight redistributed. Some nights she dreamed of her mother's voice, not words, just tone, the way it used to sound when humming low to keep fear away. Other nights she dreamed of nothing at all, a blackness that felt earned. By the time people began calling her a curse, she had accepted what she was becoming. Not a monster, not a savior, but a consequence. Christmas Eve had taken everything from her. She would spend the rest of her life making sure they cost something too. And she was only getting started.
Winter became her season, not because the cold strengthened her, but because it weakened them. Masters grew soft when the fields slept. They stayed indoors longer, trusted familiar routines, wrapped themselves in the illusion that the world slowed when crops did. She learned that power, when comfortable, forgot how to defend itself. She kept the ledger in her head. No paper, no marks that could betray her. Faces were easier to remember than words. A jawline like a broken fence post. A voice that carried too far even when whispering. Fingers stained with ink instead of dirt. Each man connected to Christmas Eve existed in her mind as a thread, and she followed those threads patiently, wherever they led. Her body changed as the years passed. Harder, leaner, shaped by movement and restraint. Pain became another sense, something that informed rather than interrupted. She learned how long she could go without food, how little sleep she needed, how to disappear into places people looked through rather than at. She learned that fear smelled metallic, that guilt sweated differently than innocence, that men who believed themselves righteous rarely suspected judgment could walk. The second overseer from that night lived farther north, managing a smaller estate that prided itself on order. Everything there ran on time. Bells rang precisely. Punishments were calculated, not emotional. He called himself fair. He had been sober on Christmas Eve all those years ago, the one who read the orders cleanly, the one who avoided her eyes as her family was taken. She arrived as labor. New hands were always needed, and paperwork traveled slower than people. She listened, she worked, she watched him age. His hair thinned, his steps slowed, his sense of control never wavered. He believed fairness absolved him. His death came without spectacle. No blood left to stain the floor, no marks for anyone to trace. When they found him, the confusion was louder than grief. A man like that was not supposed to simply stop existing. The estate blamed illness, then God, then misfortune. No one blamed her. After that, the ledger shifted. The easy names were gone. What remained were men who had learned caution, men who had heard the rumors and taken them seriously. They traveled with guards. They slept behind locked doors. They trusted fewer people. Killing them required patience measured in years rather than weeks. She followed one man across 3 states, a merchant whose wealth had grown from moving bodies like cargo. He had purchased her brother, the younger one, the one who cried when he slept. The merchant had bragged once about breaking children early, about teaching them silence before they learned rebellion. The bragging had been overheard, stored away, preserved. It took her 2 years to find where that brother had been sent after he stopped being profitable. 2 years of listening, of trading favors, of reading faces when names were mentioned. When she finally reached the place, it was already too late. A shallow grave behind a barn. No marker, no record. Just dirt that felt heavier than it should have. She stayed there through the night, hands pressed into the soil until cold numbed her fingers. There was no ceremony, no prayer, just the quiet acknowledgement of absence. She did not cry. Tears felt like something for people who expected answers. The merchant died the following winter. Slowly, not out of cruelty, but out of intention. He needed time to understand what was happening, to feel his control erode. When it was over, she felt something close to satisfaction for the first time. Not joy, but a settling, like a debt finally paid. Word spread wider after that. Planters met in groups more often. They spoke in low voices. They locked doors that had never been locked before. Some began treating the enslaved with a performance of kindness, as if mercy could retroactively protect them. Others grew harsher, tightening control out of fear. Both responses amused her equally. She noticed something else changing too. The people around her, the ones who lived under the same chains, began to sense her presence. Not her identity, but her effect. Whispers followed unexplained deaths. Hope, cautious and fragile, crept into places where it had never survived long before. She did not encourage it. Hope made people reckless, but she did not stop it either. Once, a woman pressed a piece of bread into her hand without explanation. Another time, a man looked at her with something like recognition, then looked away, choosing silence. Information began to find her instead of the other way around. Roots, names, timelines. She accepted what was offered and gave nothing back but results. Christmas Eve came again, and with it another name. The last master directly responsible for her mother's sale. Older now, wealthier. He lived in a house that sat on a hill, visible for miles, like a challenge. He had survived longer than the others because he understood danger, because he never drank too much, because he trusted no one fully. She watched him for nearly a year, learned his habits, learned the names of his dogs, learned which servants he dismissed early and which he kept close, learned the sound of his breathing through open windows. When the night finally came, the sky was clear and cruelly bright with stars. She did not rush. By dawn, the hill was quiet. She stood at the edge of the property and let herself imagine, just for a moment, that this might be the end, that balance had been restored, that the ledger was complete. The thought felt false even as it formed. Too many names still lingered. Too many hands had touched that night. As she walked away, she understood something new. She was no longer chasing the past. The past was fixed, unmovable. What she was doing now belonged entirely to the present. She had become a force that directed, not remembered. Christmas would come again, and she would be ready.
By the third decade, she stopped counting years. Time lost its edges when every season repeated the same pattern of watching, waiting, ending. Age settled into her bones without weakening her purpose. If anything, it refined it. Anger had burned itself out long ago, leaving behind something colder and more durable: intention. The ledger had changed shape. At first it had been names tied directly to that single night. Now it had widened to include men who learned from those men, who inherited estates and attitudes along with land. Sons who spoke proudly of their father's methods, partners who called brutality tradition. Systems did not die when individuals did. They adapted. So did she. She began choosing differently, no longer only those connected to her past, but those whose present echoed it too closely. Men who separated families as casually as signing receipts. Men who celebrated efficiency when it came to suffering. Christmas Eve was no longer the sole marker. It had become a symbol, a reminder of what unchecked power did when wrapped in ritual and righteousness. Her reputation grew without her name ever surfacing. Stories shifted depending on who told them. Some said she was a ghost. Others believed it was many people, an invisible army moving in coordination. A few whispered that God had grown tired of waiting. She understood why they needed myths. The truth was simpler and more unsettling. One woman could do this much damage. One woman paying attention. There were moments when she felt the weight of it press down harder than hunger or cold ever had. Nights when sleep refused to come, when memory replayed itself without mercy. Her mother's hand slipping from hers, her brother's face disappearing into darkness. In those moments, she let herself remember fully. She did not push the pain away. Pain, when acknowledged, sharpened resolve. She crossed paths once with a man who had known her mother well, an old field hand, his back bent like a question mark, his eyes still clear. He did not recognize her at first. Then something shifted, subtle but unmistakable. A pause too long, a breath caught halfway. He said nothing, but his gaze lingered with careful understanding. Later that night, he left a small bundle where she slept, a scrap of cloth worn thin with age. The pattern was familiar. Her mother's headscarf, faded but intact. She held it for a long time, not as a relic, but as proof. Proof that her memories were not inventions, that her family had existed beyond her grief. She carried it with her after that, folded small and hidden close. It did not soften her, it anchored her. Violence, she learned, did not always require blood. Sometimes it required removal, a key misplaced, a document altered, a shipment delayed until crops failed and fortunes cracked. She learned how fragile their wealth actually was, how much depended on assumption and intimidation. When those faltered, everything else followed. Not every target died by her hand. Some lost everything they thought untouchable and faded into obscurity. Others turned on each other under pressure, accusations blooming where loyalty had once been assumed. She watched from the margins, letting the system eat itself where possible. Direct action was reserved for those who refused to fall. There was one winter when she nearly stopped. She had tracked a plantation owner whose cruelty was legendary even among his peers. Men like him inspired fear without effort. The stories surrounding him were detailed, consistent, impossible to exaggerate further. When she finally reached the estate, she found it already in ruins. Fire damage, abandoned fields, shallow graves uncovered by animals. He had been killed weeks earlier, not by her, but by those he had controlled for years. She walked through the aftermath slowly. The air smelled of ash and rot. There was no satisfaction there, only exhaustion. It struck her then how much of herself had been consumed by this work, how narrow her world had become. For the first time, she wondered what would be left of her when the ledger finally emptied. That question followed her for months. She imagined a life without pursuit, without constant vigilance. The idea felt foreign, almost dangerous. She'd built herself around this purpose so completely that removing it felt like dismantling bone. Who was she if not the consequence? Who remained when there was no one left to correct? The answer came unexpectedly, on another Christmas Eve. She had not planned to act that night. She had intended to pass through quietly, avoid attention, let the holiday burn itself out. Instead, she witnessed something too familiar to ignore. A family separated under the guise of necessity, orders delivered with polite detachment, a mother pleading with eyes that knew the outcome before words ever formed. The girl being taken watched in silence, not crying, not resisting, memorizing. Something inside her shifted. She intervened without thinking, without planning, without the careful patience she had perfected over years. The men did not expect resistance. They never did. The aftermath was swift, decisive, irreversible. When it was over, the family remained intact, shaking but whole. She did not stay to explain, did not offer comfort or promises. She disappeared before dawn, as she always had. But as she walked, she understood something new. This had never been only about the past. It had been about interruption, about stopping the moment before it hardened into history. The ledger was no longer just about revenge. It was about prevention. That realization did not lighten her burden. It deepened it. The work would never truly end. As long as power existed without accountability, there would be nights like this one. Families standing at the edge of permanent loss. Children learning silence too early. She accepted that. By the time the rumors evolved again, she no longer listened. Let them call her whatever helped them sleep. Curse, angel, devil, myth. None of it mattered. What mattered was the space she created between cruelty and its completion. Christmas Eve came and went, then another still. And every year, somewhere, someone slept beside their family because she had chosen not to stop.